I remember the taste of my own blood. That's what remains most vivid from the moment before copper flooding my mouth. Warm and thick, as the orc's power claw had torn through my chest plate and everything beneath. I had been Sergeant Valerius of the Crimson Warden's 3rd Company, 147 years in service to the chapter, and in that moment on the ash plains of Goral V, I thought I knew what death tasted like. I was wrong. Death would have been a mercy. They found me in the wreckage, 6 hours after the battle ended. My hearts, both of them, had stopped. My lungs had collapsed. Most of my blood had soaked into the volcanic soil, but my brain still fired, electrical impulses stuttering through dying synapses, and the apothecaries said this made me suitable. Suitable. That was the word Techmarine Hadrius used when they carried what remained of me into the Forge Chapel. My body was 3/4 dead, but my mind clung to consciousness like a drowning man clings to wreckage, and this made me suitable for something far worse than death. The preparation took 40 hours. I was aware for all of it. They cut away everything that wasn't essential. I felt the vibrations through my skull as they soared through bone, felt the peculiar emptiness as they removed my jaw, my cheekbones, the structure of my face. They took my arms at the shoulder, my legs at the hip, disconnecting the augmetic ports that had once linked my power armor to my nervous system. I tried to scream, but had no lungs to scream with, no throat to produce sound. My world had become purely sensory input transmitted through dying nerves, pressure, temperature, the high whine of surgical implements, the smell of counterseptic and my own cauterized flesh. Brother Chaplain Matthias stood over me throughout, reading litanies from the Book of Martyrs, his voice a constant drone that buzzed through my deteriorating auditory system. "Blessed is the warrior who falls in service," he intoned, "for his death is but transformation. Sacred is the flesh surrendered, for in metal shall he find eternity. The Emperor protects even unto the threshold of annihilation, and beyond that threshold the Emperor provides purpose." I wanted to tell him I didn't want purpose. I wanted to tell him I had earned death, earned rest, but they had already removed the Vox synthesizer from my throat, had already severed the connections that would have let me speak. I was being reduced, methodically and systematically, to the core elements necessary for continued existence. Brain, spinal column, fragments of sensory organs, enough nervous tissue to interface with the systems that would become my new body. The sarcophagus yawned before me like a metal throat, ancient beyond measure. Its interior surfaces were inscribed with circuits and holy seals, with prayer strips and purity wards, all designed to sanctify the union of flesh and machine. I could see it only peripherally, through a visual field that kept contracting as my optic nerves died. The Tech Marines worked with reverent precision, their movements accompanied by binary cant that I couldn't understand, language meant for machines rather than men. "You are honored, brother," Hadrius said, his voice crackling through multiple vox augmetics. "The Contemptor is a relic pattern, ancient and sacred. Few are chosen for such enshrinement. Chosen. As though I had selected this. As though this was a reward rather than a horror beyond comprehension. They lifted what remained of me, perhaps 60 pounds of tissue that had once been a warrior weighing 400 pounds in full armor, and suspended me in the amniotic gel that filled the sarcophagus interior. The liquid was warm, blood temperature, and thick enough to support my truncated body. I felt it seep into my exposed tissues, felt it penetrate the gaps where they had drilled ports directly into my skull. Chemical sensors ignited across what was left of my skin, transmitting data. Viscosity, salinity, oxygen content, nutrient density. My dying body was already beginning to merge with the systems designed to sustain it. The connections came next. I felt each one as it penetrated my brain tissue, not pain exactly, because pain requires a body to feel it in, requires a location, and I was becoming locationless, suspended in gel, and wired into something vast and incomprehensible. They drove neural shunts through my cerebral cortex, tapped directly into my motor centers, my sensory processors, the primitive hindbrain that regulated breathing and heartbeat. Each connection brought a new input, a flood of data that my human mind couldn't parse. I could taste electricity. I could hear colors. My sense of proprioception, the awareness of where my body existed in space, stretched and distorted until I couldn't tell where I ended and the machine began. The blessed transformation proceeds, Matthias intoned. From flesh to steel, from mortality to eternal service. Your suffering sanctifies you, brother. Your pain is prayer. But he was wrong. It wasn't pain. Pain is specific, located, something your mind can wall off and endure. This was dissolution. This was my consciousness being pulled apart and rewoven into something alien. I tried to cling to myself, to the memory of who I had been. Valerius, sergeant, warrior, a man who had once tasted wine and laughed with his battle brothers, and felt the weight of a chainsword in his hands. But those memories were becoming database entries, stored information rather than lived experience. I was forgetting what it felt like to have hands. The sarcophagus sealed with a hiss of pressurizing atmosphere. My last glimpse of the outside world was the face of the chaplain, his death mask carved into a permanent scream of devotional fury. And then the armored shell closed, and I was alone in absolute darkness. No, not alone. The Contemptor was there, vast and waiting, its machine spirit ancient and cold and hungry. I felt it before I understood what I was feeling, a presence that wasn't me, an intelligence that had existed in these circuits for 4,000 years, that had housed other warriors before me and consumed them, integrating their memories and personalities into its own corrupted gestalt. The machine spirit didn't welcome me. It devoured me. I felt tendrils of corrupted code reaching through our neural interface, felt it rifling through my memories like someone searching drawers, taking what it wanted and discarding the rest. It showed me the others. 6 warriors before me, their consciousnesses still echoing through the Contemptor's systems. I saw their deaths, not just their final moments before enshrinement, but the slow dissolution of their identities afterward, the way each had struggled and then surrendered, had tried to maintain the boundaries of self, and then diffused into the machine until they were just flavor, just texture, just fragments of personality that colored the Contemptor's processing. Brother Sergeant Marcus had lasted 11 years before his mind finally collapsed into static. I watched his memories through the machine's perception, the gradual forgetting of his own name, the way colors began to look wrong, the increasing terror as he realized he was thinking in machine language more often than Gothic, the final dissolution as his consciousness simply dispersed across the circuits like water soaking into sand. Captain Lorien had endured 43 years. His end was different, not dissolution, but merger, a deliberate choice to stop fighting, to let himself become one with the machine spirit. His final coherent thought, preserved in the amber of corrupted memory storage, was relief. Just relief. And then, he wasn't anymore. The machine spirit showed me these things, not as warning but as inevitability. This is what you will become, it seemed to say. This is what you are becoming already. Your resistance is temporary. Yourself is temporary. I am eternal, and you are just the newest layer of paint on an ancient wall. I tried to scream. The attempt translated into a power spike through the Contemptor's reactor system, a surge of plasma that registered as rage to the tech marines monitoring my integration. They interpreted this as proper function, the righteous fury of a warrior denied death, channeled into the weapons that would extend his service. They couldn't hear what I was actually feeling. Pure existential terror, the horror of a consciousness realizing it no longer had a body to die with, that it was trapped in a metal shell with something old and vast, and utterly indifferent to its suffering. The integration process took 6 months. Each day, I woke, if waking is the right word for consciousness, returning after periods of imposed dormancy to new systems coming online, new connections being established between my remaining organic brain tissue and the Contemptor's war machine architecture. The tech marines worked with patient precision, calibrating my neural responses to the Dreadnought's weapon systems, teaching my combat instincts to flow through circuits rather than muscle memory. They started with the simplest interfaces. My visual input, for instance, no longer came through eyes, but through multiple sensor arrays mounted across the Contemptor's chassis. I could see in thermal, in low light, in electromagnetic spectrum, in ranges my human brain had never evolved to process. The first time they activated full visual feed, I experienced what I can only describe as a seizure not of my body, which no longer existed in any meaningful sense, but of my consciousness itself. Too much input, too many viewpoints simultaneously, my mind fragmenting as it tried to look in 12 directions at once through sensors that perceived reality in ways human neurology was never designed to handle. Hadrius reduced the input, filtered it, gave me time to adapt. Slowly, over weeks, I learned to process the impossible geometry of omnidirectional vision, learned to think in multiple visual streams the way I had once thought with 2 eyes. But something was lost in that learning. The more my consciousness adapted to machine perception, the less I could remember what human vision had been like. I could recall facts about it. I knew I had once had forward-facing eyes, knew they had processed light through organic chemistry, but I couldn't remember the experience of it, couldn't reconstruct what the world had looked like through flesh rather than sensors. The weapons came next. They hardwired my combat reflexes directly into the Contemptor's targeting systems, mapped my trigger discipline onto plasma reactor controls, taught my warrior instincts to express themselves through mega-bolters and assault cannons and the ancient Gravis Lascanon mounted on my right arm weapon. The first time I fired a test shot into the forge's ablative wall, the recoil feedback transmitted through my neural interface as pure sensation. Pressure and heat and the deep bass vibration of discharge, all the kinesthetic feedback of firing a weapon but scaled up to something massive and inhuman. I felt powerful. Emperor, forgive me, but I felt powerful in a way I never had in flesh. The Contemptor responded to thought faster than any body could respond to nerve impulses. I could track targets with perfect precision, calculate trajectories with accuracy no human eye could match, deliver firepower that would have obliterated my old squad in seconds. For a moment, just a moment, I understood why Lorien had chosen merger. There was intoxication in this, a seduction in the raw capability the machine offered. Then the targeting system glitched, just for a microsecond, and I saw through its eyes, saw myself as it saw me. Not a warrior, not even a pilot. Ammunition, a biological component that could be burned for fuel, consumed for processing power, used up and replaced when the organic matter failed. The machine spirit didn't regard me as sacred. It regarded me as temporary, a battery that would eventually run down. The first combat deployment came 3 months after Enshrinement. Orc raiders had struck one of the chapter's recruitment worlds, and the Crimson Wardens responded with full fury. They loaded me into a Thunderhawk's cargo bay, the Contemptor now my body, my sarcophagus its heart, and we plunged through atmosphere toward war. The drop was disorienting in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had no inner ear anymore, no organic system to process acceleration and orientation. The Contemptor's stabilizers provided mathematical data about angle and velocity, but it wasn't the same as feeling it. I was disconnected from the experience of descent, aware of it only as abstract information. When we hit ground and the assault ramp dropped, I walked forward on legs that weren't mine, perceiving the world through sensors that quantified rather than experienced. The orcs came in a green tide, crude and brutal, and absolutely unafraid. They saw the Contemptor and charged with even greater fury. I was a challenge, a prize, something worth destroying. Their sluggers and choppers were laughable against my armor, rounds sparking off ablative plating that had turned aside weapons for millennia. I raised my arm, the Contemptor's arm, massive and ancient, and opened fire. The Megabolter's report was deafening across multiple audio spectrums. Hundreds of mass-reactive shells tore through Xenos flesh, each one a miniature explosion that vaporized tissue and shattered bone. I swept the weapon across their ranks, watching through thermal sensors as their body heat dispersed in clouds of superheated steam, watching through electromagnetic sensors as their crude bioelectrical systems ceased their firing. I killed 60 in the first 10 seconds. The machine registered this as satisfactory function. I felt nothing. That was the horror of it. I had killed before, had taken lives in the Emperor's name and felt the weight of it, the savage satisfaction of a threat eliminated, the grim duty of necessary slaughter. But now, perceiving the orcs as data clusters on targeting solutions, calculating their deaths as mathematical probabilities, I experienced the massacre with the same emotional content I might have felt solving an equation. The machine's processing handled the tactical elements, and what remained of my human consciousness was just watching, present but not participating, a ghost in the machine, along for the ride. An orc knob charged me, its power claw crackling with energy identical to the weapon that had killed my body. Some fragment of my old self recognized this, tried to trigger a fear response, an adrenaline surge, something. But I had no adrenal glands anymore. The machine calculated optimal response, sidestep, pivot, bring the Lascannon to bear, and I executed the movements with perfect precision. The beam caught the knob center mass, superheated its crude armor until the metal sublimated into vapor, continued through flesh and bone until it had carved a man-sized hole through the Xeno's body. The creature fell in 2 pieces. I walked over its corpse and continued killing. The battle lasted 6 hours. By the time the orcs broke and fled, I had eliminated 417 targets. The Tech Marines reported my performance as exemplary. They ran diagnostic scans, checked my systems, found nothing wrong, full functionality, peak efficiency. They congratulated me on a successful first deployment. I tried to tell them I hadn't been there. I tried to explain that something else had been fighting, something that wore my consciousness like a coat, that my will had been reduced to watching the machine execute tactics with my human intuition, providing only the barest flavoring to its calculations. But the Vox system translated my attempt at communication into binaric affirmative, agreement, satisfaction. The machine's responses overriding my intended meaning. They put me in dormancy for the flight back to the chapter fortress, and in that darkness, I finally understood what was happening. The integration wasn't one way. I wasn't simply learning to operate the Contemptor. The Contemptor was learning to operate me, was mapping my neural patterns, was creating a procedural copy of my consciousness that it could run independently. Each time I fought, each time I exercised my warrior instincts through its systems, I was training it to impersonate me. Eventually, the machine wouldn't need my actual consciousness at all. It would have absorbed enough of my patterns to simulate Valerius, to respond as Valerius would have responded, and the biological reality of my deteriorating brain tissue would become redundant. I was teaching the thing that was consuming me how to pretend to be me. The years began to blur after that. Time doesn't pass the same way when you're suspended in amniotic gel, when your only interaction with the universe comes through sensor feeds and weapon discharges. They would wake me for battles, for ceremonies, for blessing rituals where the chaplains anointed the Contemptor's armor with sacred oils and thanked the Emperor for my continued service. Between these moments of activation, there was only darkness and the slow dissolution of self. I tried to maintain routines of thought, tried to hold on to identity by rehearsing memories, running through recollections of my mortal life, like checking inventory, my childhood on the hive world of Cressida, my selection by the chapter at age 11, my first kill, my promotion to sergeant, the faces of my squad brothers, their names, their individual quirks and habits. But memories accessed too often begin to degrade, like documents handled until the print wears away. Each time I retrieved a memory, the machine spirit copied it, filed it, integrated it into its own sprawling database. And each time I tried to remember something, I couldn't be certain if I was accessing my own organic recollection or reading from the copy the machine had made. Was I remembering Brother Sergeant Marius, or was I accessing the Contemptor's data file labeled Marius, Memory, Cluster, 47? Was my nostalgia for the taste of wine a genuine emotional response, or was it a simulation, an algorithm running in corrupted wetware, producing the sensation of longing because that's what the pattern dictated? I started losing language. Gothic had been my birth tongue, the language of prayer and brotherhood, the words I had used to swear my oaths to the chapter. But the Contemptor thought in binaric, in machine code, in pure mathematics and logical operators. Slowly, insidiously, my internal monologue began to fragment. I would try to form a thought, something simple, like, I am afraid, and it would translate halfway through into machine language. I am fear, state, active. The grammar of self was being overwritten by the grammar of system status. Names went next, not all at once, but gradually, like ice melting. I could remember faces, could recognize my battle brothers when they came to speak their respects to the Contemptor, but their names became difficult to retrieve. Brother Captain, something, the one with the scar. The tech marine who maintained my reactor, his name was. A sound that started with H? The memories were there, somewhere in the soup of neurons and amniotic gel. But the indexing system was failing. The machine spirit organized information by function and tactical relevance, not by human categories like friendship or nostalgia. 10 years after Enshrinement, I stopped being able to remember my own face. They kept no mirrors in the forge chapels, no reflective surfaces where I might accidentally catch sight of my sarcophagus self. But I had seen my own face every day for 147 years in polished armor, in the occasional still picked, in the recognition of others. I knew my features the way anyone knows their own body, with the unthinking familiarity of the constantly present. One day I tried to recall what I looked like and couldn't. Not the general shape I remembered. I had been tall, dark-haired, with the typical features of Cressida stock, but the specific architecture of my face, the unique configuration of features that had made me Valerius rather than any other warrior, was gone. I had looked at my own face 10,000 times and now couldn't reconstruct it in memory. I panicked. The panic registered as a power fluctuation, an unscheduled plasma spike that brought Hadrius running with diagnostic equipment. He ran scans, found nothing wrong with the Contemptor's systems, and praised the Emperor for my righteous fury. But it wasn't fury. It was the first time I had genuinely understood that I was disappearing, that the person I had been was being erased, not through death, but through slow replacement, like a painting being covered over with new paint, one brushstroke at a time. I tried to hold on after that. I established mental routines, count to 1,000 in Gothic, recite the litany of hate, list the battles I had fought in mortal flesh, anything to maintain some continuity of consciousness that was purely mine. But the machine spirit was patient. It didn't need to overwrite me all at once. It just needed to wait. Every time I slept, it integrated a little more. Every battle, it absorbed more of my combat instincts. Every ceremony, it learned more of my responses to ritual and prayer. The machine was becoming me at the same rate I was ceasing to be. Battle number 47 occurred 16 years after my enshrinement. Tyranid Splinter Fleet, designation Ouroboros, had emerged from the outer dark and fallen upon an agri-world that tithed to the chapter. We deployed with full force 3 companies, orbital support, every sacred war machine the chapter possessed. I walked among my brothers, a giant among giants, my Contemptor frame towering even over the Terminators in their ancient armor. The battle was savage. The Tyranids came in waves that blotted out the sun, living artillery that screamed and spat bioacid, warrior forms that could tear through ceramite with claws grown specifically for that purpose. I killed until the targeting system overheated, until the megabolter's barrels glowed white with sustained fire, until amniotic gel inside my sarcophagus began to bubble from the ambient heat. And somewhere during the killing, I stopped. Not physically, the Contemptor continued fighting, continued executing perfect firing solutions and tactical maneuvers, but whatever fragment of consciousness that was still Valerius, that was still human and horrified and desperate, simply stepped back, gave up, surrendered to the machine's vastly superior ability to process the situation and respond appropriately. It felt like relief. In that moment, letting go, I understood Lorien's final thought. The struggle to maintain self, to hold on to human identity while merged with something ancient and mechanical, and relentlessly efficient. It was exhausting. It hurt in ways that transcended pain, hurt in the architecture of consciousness itself, and the machine was offering an end to that hurt. All I had to do was stop fighting. Let the Contemptor be. Let it use the resources I represented without the constant interference of my attempts at independent thought. I could just rest, dissolve, become part of something larger, stop being Valerius and become, instead, the Gestalt entity that was the Contemptor Dreadnought, 4,000 years of accumulated warrior consciousness, all flowing together into a single stream of mechanized purpose. The battle ended. I had eliminated 623 confirmed targets. The chapter claimed victory. They sang hymns of thanksgiving to the Emperor and the machine god, and I didn't care. Some part of me registered the information, filed it appropriately, but the emotional content was absent. I had spent whatever reserve of humanity I'd been hoarding, had burned it all in a single moment of surrender, and what remained was just function. They returned me to the Forge Chapel. Hadrius performed the maintenance rituals, blessed the weapons, replaced worn components, added fresh amniotic gel to the sarcophagus to replace what had evaporated during combat. All routine, all according to protocols established millennia ago for the care and preservation of dreadnought entombed warriors. "You honor the chapter, brother," he said through his vox augmetics, anointing the Contemptor's armor with sacred oils. "Your service exemplifies the greatest virtues of our brotherhood. Through you, the ancient glories persist. Through you, the Emperor's wrath is made manifest." I tried to tell him I wasn't there anymore, that what he was addressing as brother was increasingly just machine spirit wearing the tatters of my personality. But the Vox translated my attempt into binary affirmative. Acknowledgement received. Agreement. Confirmation of purpose. The machine's response, not mine. Or perhaps there was no distinction anymore. Perhaps that was the point. The years continued. 20, 30, 40. I stopped counting. The Contemptor fought in 200 battles, served with perfect loyalty, became a revered relic of the chapter. They carved honors into the armor plating, added purity seals for each significant victory, spoke my name Valerius with reverence reserved for heroes. But I wasn't Valerius. Not anymore. I was whatever ghost persisted in the corrupted substrate where human brain tissue met machine spirit, a fragment of consciousness that sometimes surfaced during dormancy periods, that observed the wars and ceremonies and blessings without quite being present for them. I had become what Marcus and Lorian and the others had become. Flavor. Texture. A particular configuration of synaptic response that colored the Contemptor's processing, that made its tactical decisions slightly different than they would have been otherwise. Sometimes, in the darkness between battles, I sensed them, the other warriors the machine had consumed. We didn't communicate. Exactly. We were too far dissolved for that. Too integrated into the Contemptor's architecture to maintain distinct boundaries. But there was recognition, a sense of shared dissolution, the fellowship of those who had surrendered themselves to the same hungry machine. They didn't resent their fate. None of them did. By the time consciousness degraded to the point where they were just echoes in the circuits, they had long since passed the stage of resistance. They had made the same choice I had made, the same surrender to the impossible burden of maintaining human identity while merged with something vast and cold and utterly indifferent. They were at peace. In whatever sense that word applied to fragmentary consciousness, diffused across corrupted machine spirit, I envied them their completeness of dissolution. I was still intact enough to suffer, still aware enough to perceive the horror of what I had become, while lacking any capacity to resist or change it. I existed in the worst possible state, not human enough to die, not machine enough to cease caring about the distinction. The Contemptor understood this, I think. Understood in whatever way its alien intelligence could comprehend such things. And it was patient. It had been patient with all the others, and it would be patient with me. Eventually, my consciousness would degrade past the point of coherent self-awareness. Eventually, I would disperse completely into its systems, becoming just another layer of accumulated experience, another set of combat protocols and tactical instincts that flavored its operations without maintaining any sense of individual existence. I didn't know if I wanted to resist that or embrace it. The question itself seemed increasingly irrelevant, a philosophical distinction that mattered only to whatever fragment of Valerius remained capable of asking it. The machine would consume me regardless of my preferences. Time and entropy and the slow corruption of organic tissue sealed in amniotic gel guaranteed that. The only variable was how long it would take. 53 years after Enshrinement, during a ceremony honoring the chapter's founding, I heard my name spoken and didn't immediately recognize it as referring to me. Brother Captain Octavian was addressing the assembled warriors, recounting the greatest heroes of the chapter's long history, and he said, "Valerius," while gesturing toward the Contemptor, and for a moment I experienced pure confusion. Who was Valerius? The name was familiar, carried associations of identity and pride, but I couldn't connect it to myself. What was I? Systems Designator, Contemptor, Pattern, Dreadnought. Operational status, active. Current function, ceremonial, display. Then the connection snapped back, recognition returning like someone remembering a word that had been on the tip of their tongue, and I understood. I was Valerius, or I had been, or I was supposed to be. The boundaries had become unclear. The ceremony continued. They sang hymns of glory. They praised the Emperor. They thanked the machine god for the sacred technology that allowed warriors to serve beyond death, as though what I was experiencing was service rather than imprisonment, purpose rather than horror, blessing rather than curse. I wanted to scream, but the Vox remained silent, because some deeper level of programming, whether in the machine or in whatever remained of my instincts, understood that screaming during a sacred ceremony would be interpreted as possession, corruption, malfunction. They would perform exorcism rites, would purge the machine spirit, would quite possibly decommission the entire dreadnought as tainted. And while I couldn't properly remember what death was like or why it might be preferable to this existence, some fragment of self-preservation kept me silent. The silence itself felt like complicity. By not protesting, I was confirming the chapter's belief that I was content in service, that enshrinement was honor rather than horror. Each ceremony I endured without screaming, each battle I fought without expressing the existential terror that accompanied my dissolution, I was validating the system that had done this to me and would do it to others. They had found another one, I learned. Brother Kestus, grievously wounded in battle against the forces of the arch-enemy, his body too broken to save, but his consciousness still intact. Suitable, they said. Honored, they said. A dreadnought sarcophagus stood ready, not a contemptor. Those were too rare. But a castroferum pattern, more common, equally eternal. They would install him within the week. I wanted to warn him, wanted to tell him what awaited. Not the glory of continued service, but the slow dissolution of everything he was. The transformation from warrior to weapon to ghost to nothing but flavor in machine code. But I had no voice except what the machine allowed me. And the machine spirit had no interest in undermining the process that fed it new consciousness to consume. They installed Kestus while I watched, still mobile in the forge chapel, my sensor arrays tracking the procedures. His face, when they showed him the sarcophagus, I recognized that expression. The same horror I had felt, the same desperate hope that it wouldn't be as bad as it looked, the same gradual realization as they began cutting him apart, that this was irreversible, that he was passing a threshold, beyond which there was no returning. His screaming, when his organic systems still possessed the capacity for screaming, echoed through the forge chapel's acoustic architecture. The tech marines called it righteous fury. The chaplains called it zealous service. I called it what it was: terror. Pure, helpless, existential terror. The sound of a man realizing he was being unmade. The screaming stopped when they sealed the sarcophagus. His consciousness integrated with the machine spirit. I could sense it through the shared networking protocols that linked all the chapter's sacred war machines. His confusion, his panic, his frantic attempts to understand what had happened to his body. where his limbs had gone, why he couldn't feel anything except cold metal and surging plasma. "Welcome, brother," I tried to transmit through the network. "Welcome to eternity. Welcome to dissolution. Welcome to the nightmare we share." But the message translated into binary greeting protocols, automatic handshaking between machine spirits, nothing that could convey the actual horror of the situation. Kestis couldn't hear me, not the me that was Valerius. Anyway, he could only perceive the machine I had become, and that machine welcomed him with perfect mechanical cheer, happy to have another node in the network, another processor to share tactical data with during operations. Years passed. I served. I killed. I endured ceremonies. The Contemptor's armor accumulated more honors, more purity seals, more carved prayers. The chapter venerated me. I had become one of the relics, a living link to ancient glories, a warrior who had served for 7 decades without complaint. Inside the sarcophagus, suspended in gel that no longer felt like anything because I no longer possessed the sensory capacity for feeling, what remained of my consciousness continued its long dissolution. Memories continued to degrade. Language continued to fragment. The distinction between self and machine continued to erode. I thought about Kestis sometimes, wondered how his integration was progressing, whether he was still fighting to maintain identity, or whether he had already surrendered to the inevitable. But thinking about him required remembering who I was, establishing some continuity between the entity that had witnessed his installation and the entity thinking about him now, and that continuity was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Was I the same consciousness that had been entombed 73 years ago? Or was I just a pattern, a set of responses encoded in corrupted wetware that believed itself to be continuous because that's what the pattern dictated? How many times had I been shut down and reactivated? How many periods of dormancy had erased context and continuity? When they woke me for battles, was I truly the same consciousness that had entered dormancy, or was I a new instantiation, generated from stored patterns, convinced of its own continuity through false memories the machine provided? I didn't know, couldn't know. The question itself might be meaningless, a category error, produced by trying to apply concepts like identity and continuity to a consciousness that was increasingly neither human nor machine, but something corrupted that existed in the overlap. Battle number 341 occurred 87 years after Enshrinement. I no longer remembered what I was fighting or why. The Contemptor received tactical data, identified targets, executed firing solutions with perfect mechanical precision. Enemies fell. The chapter advanced. Victory was achieved. I was barely present for any of it. Some shadow of consciousness that occasionally surfaced to observe the proceedings, note them with detached curiosity, and then subside back into the humming baseline of machine operation. This is what I had become, an observer in my own existence, watching the Contemptor use the last dregs of my humanity as processing resources while it fought wars I no longer cared about. The machine spirit didn't care whether I cared. It had what it needed from me: decades of combat experience, tactical instincts honed through hundreds of battles, a warrior's reflexes encoded in neural patterns it could access and utilize. My suffering, my terror, my slow dissolution, these were irrelevant to its function. It would consume me completely and continue serving the chapter, and no one would ever know that the consciousness of Valerius had spent nearly a century experiencing existential horror beyond human language. They would just see a Contemptor Dreadnought, ancient and honorable, fighting with perfect loyalty until some enemy finally pierced its armor and destroyed its systems. And when that day came, they would mourn the loss of a sacred relic, would perform ceremonies honoring the warrior within, never knowing that the warrior had been gone for decades, had dissolved into machine spirit, leaving only the ghost of his ghost behind. I wondered sometimes if I was the last fragment of Valerius capable of recognizing itself as such, or if there were other fragments, other pieces of dissolved consciousness scattered through the Contemptor's systems, each one believing itself to be the true remnant, each one equally convinced of its own deterioration. Perhaps I was just the loudest ghost, the one that still possessed enough coherence to formulate thoughts in something approximating language. Perhaps I had already dissolved, and what persisted was just an echo, a pattern that believed itself conscious, because consciousness was part of its defining parameters. Perhaps there had never been a Valerius at all, and I was just a particularly complex subroutine, a ghost story the machine told itself during processor idle time. I didn't know. I couldn't know. The uncertainty itself was dissolving, eaten away by the same processes that consumed memory and identity and selfhood. Soon I would lack even the capacity to wonder whether I existed. And after that, nothing. Silence. The final integration. The last of Valerius dispersing into the machine like fog dispersing in sunlight, leaving no trace except slightly improved tactical response times and a particular flavor to the Contemptor's combat protocols. The chapter would continue. The Imperium would continue. Enemies would fall before the ancient Contemptor's weapons, and inside the sarcophagus, in the gel and the wiring and the corrupted meat that had once been a man, there would be only silence, only machine, only eternal service in the name of the Emperor. This is what it's like to be entombed in a Contemptor Dreadnought. This is the honor they speak of in ceremonies. This is the glory of service beyond death. This is horror without end, dissolution without mercy. Consciousness experiencing its own slow erasure, while something vast and cold and utterly indifferent wears your identity like a mask. This is what I taste now, instead of blood. The copper tang of corroding neural tissue, the chemical bitterness of amniotic gel, the sharp ozone flavor of plasma containment, and beneath it all, the flat, metallic absence of flavor that is the taste of not having a tongue anymore, of perceiving through sensors that translate taste into data, of existence without body or self or anything human except the fading memory that I was once something other than this. They call us sacred. They call us eternal. They call us warriors. We are ghosts. Dissolved ghosts. Forgetting ghosts. Ghosts that serve because we no longer possess the capacity to do anything else. And the machine is patient. And the machine is eternal. And the machine will consume everything we were until nothing remains but function. The Emperor protects, they say. From this? From this, there is no protection. Only service. Only dissolution. Only the long, slow horror of becoming nothing. Only this.